Hello folks, the name's Devin and that's official, and today I wanted to take a seemingly pointless look at the things that surprised me about Total War Warhammer when I played it. The main gist and the quick version of this whole video is that I thought they would stray much further from the gameplay of the previous Total War games by exploiting the chances this license would give them. In this video I'll give a few impressions of the sorts of changes I was expecting them to make, and as you might guess it's mostly stuff that didn't happen. I should add that even though this is all going to come across as rather critical, I do think it's a good game, I had fun playing it, and all this is hopefully just a bit of fun rather than a damning sermon or anything like that. So clearly CA didn't need to make it different from their usual formula, since the difference in setting was enough to sell a new game. But the long development time made me think that maybe something new was being brewed gameplay wise. Plus there was talk that it was a new team taking on the project, rather than the usual developers who at the time of the hype birth events were under heavy scrutiny from fans due to Rome 2 facing the threat of death on arrival. Taken together, old man Devin started to expect something different, along the lines of how Empire and Medieval 2 not only have different settings, aesthetics and units, but have large sets of game-defining mechanics that make them very distinct games scientifically. In my view, Warhammer is only a few extra bells and whistles being clear of a mod for a basic, perhaps earlier version of Total War Attila, which, although clear from their marketing well in advance, still caught me off guard a little when I actually played it. It seems the long development time was mainly artistic, with the game looking amazing, as well as running amazing, so I'm sure lots of time was spent just taking the Total War 3 engine used to build Rome 2 and Attila and making it more efficient. Very handy indeed, but as I said, not the direction I secretly hoped it was all going. Anyway, so what I'm going to do here is draw on some of my expectations from before release to give you a few visions of an alternate future, where instead of Total War Warhammer, we got Warhammer Total War. A new game in a more pure sense of the word. Not applying the Total War formula to Warhammer, but making a Warhammer themed version of the formula that will appeal to Total War fans. I'm not being strictly lore or tabletop game rules friendly here since I don't know it in detail, so maybe some of these ideas can be thrown out on those grounds, let me know. No clear place to start, so let's go with the Orcs. Orcs are all about violence, love of war, teeth and status. In Total War Warhammer they play just as any other faction, however they are the only faction to inherit the integrity system from Attila, renamed Fightiness. At max Fightiness you get a free stack of troops to help you in your campaign, and when it's low you take attrition from infighting. It's a little different, but it doesn't change how you play the game too much. It encourages aggression to avoid low fightiness, a great fit for the Orcs. But it also makes the game a lot easier since the WAR units are free, and it ups the auto-resolve ratio above the already fairly high level. Overall, I think it's a cool addition, but it wasn't what I thought they would do with the Orcs. Since Orcs are all about fighting, I expected a big difference to emerge on the battlefield. I imagine that Orcs would have disorderly formations and impetuous, swarming units that were desperate to get fighting, with huge numbers that hope to overwhelm the enemy right away, almost like a biological weapon in the style of the Tyrannid swarms of Warhammer 40k. It could have been that their main rank and file Orcs and Goblins fought like berserkers in previous Total War titles, where you basically point them at the enemy and let them rip. Powerful charges that are hard to withdraw. Maybe you'd even just indicate a charge path for the unit and it would just rampage forwards, killing friend or foe until they hit something powerful enough to stop them. They would be quite deadly in melee, as even the measly orc boy is a beast to be reckoned with for an even more measly human or dwarf, but they would still suffer greatly against units in tight formations who are able to stop their charges and exploit the lack of teamwork from the highly internally competitive orcs. A compact formation would ensure several opponents are always going up against single orcs, so despite orcs being powerful creatures, they would still be beatable by the guile of smaller foes. They would rip through a loose formation of zombies in seconds, but be sent reeling back by a wall of shielded spearmen who have the morale not to run. The The higher tier units would be under direct command as they are in the current game, as you need some ability to actually do tactics and the like. But your lowest trash, your goblins, orc boys and that sort of thing, would be a fire and forget weapon, unleashed like a wave to break on the enemy line and create chances for your direct control units to get in there and exploit things. So your first focus in the battle might be deciding how to use all of your super cheap, expendable, low morale but powerful orc mobs, and then once you've given them something to charge at and let them loose like the warhounds in previous Total Wars, you follow up with your bosses, more disciplined orcs and special units to make the losses of your wave of trash count for something. Alternatively, all these trash units could actually be like the followers of your bigger units to make things even more unique for the orcs. Continuing the Warhound analogy, you'd have your unit of black orcs with 40 members or whatever, and then around them is a mob of 100 orc boys who follow them like dogs follow the dog handlers. You can choose to keep them close to the unit to absorb missile fire and charges, making it better in melee, or let the mob loose to do as it pleases, smashing routers or forcing a unit to break its formation before the black orcs arrive at the fight. The more big, hard and knobby the orc unit, the greater the size of this entourage of goblins and orc followers would be. Whether these low-end units would also be available as independent units is another question, probably I'd say, but that's more detail than we need for now. When playing against them, you'd be trying to balance having units with good anti-charge formations on the front line without leaving them vulnerable to missile fire, the counter to tight formation use. You'll also be looking to try and draw more powerful units away from the main fight so that the remaining orcs get scared or give up, or even try to delay them so that you don't have to engage the powerful orcs until the main rush of lesser orcs is expended. On the campaign map, nothing would really need to be too different, only that the low-end orcs would replenish really fast since they're just growing out of the ground. But the quality units still replenish slow, since they're drawn from the few survivors of the trash units who have shown their skills in battle and simply can't be grown to be amazing. I don't know much about the lore, obviously, but I think that roughly fits, adjust as appropriate, etc. Economically, the orcs are fine as they are, I'd say. Total War Warhammer uses a fairly simple campaign system with fewer variables, fewer buildings, fewer things to worry about in general compared to Rome 2 or Attila, which the mechanics are conceptually borrowed from. For the Orcs, this feels just right, as concerns about the economy of their back provinces aren't really important, and rebellions are just another chance for a fight, so are pretty much welcomed. In fact, on that topic, perhaps it should have been that when Orcs crush a rebellion, they get a really massive boost to their public order as a result of how much they love it. Anyway, the management of your territory should be limited by design when it comes to the Orcs, and the game is appropriately shallow in this regard already. Overall, the imagined battle system of having the Orcs be more animalistic in their use would not only make the Orcs play differently to the usual Total War affair, but do so in a way that fits the lore and mood of the faction. Their gameplay would not just be unique, but uniquely Orcish. So now let's switch to the nearby enemies of the Orcs, the Dwarves. At a distance, I think the Dwarves are done as I had expected. Loads of slow, small, hard-to-kill units that utilise machinery more than other factions. The missing element for me seems to be a mechanic that didn't make it over from previous Total Wars, much to my surprise and disappointment I must say, individual unit formations and abilities. I feel like the Dwarves should be the #1 faction for using disciplined formation-based abilities like shield walls to protect their smaller armies from harm. All with pros and cons, so that there's at least a little thought required in going in to engage them. As they are now, they're just pretty strong in all situations, which means you don't have to think much when playing as them, and can't really come up with anything special to exploit their weaknesses when playing against them. Or maybe just bring cavalry! I had hatched this idea that the Dwarves would use their firearms in the melee lines, perhaps having a special formation where a shield wall of dwarf warriors could have thunderers almost garrisoned into it, allowing the thunderers to fire over crouched dwarves, or even stand on top of their shields. The artillery pieces like the cannons and flamethrowers would have formation abilities where the crew run forward to create a protective wall of shields in front of it while it's not firing, making it nice to use right on the front line unlike the artillery of other factions. I'm basically imagining that Dwarven heavy infantry are like mobile, dynamic fortifications that support the use of their machinery, turning field battles almost into half siege battles, all the while still being okay-ish in melee if needed. That seems pretty spot on in terms of playing to the faction's lore traits, i.e. clever but physically small. and once again gives something a little different to the usual two lines of things run at each other approach to the battles in the game. A compromise might just be to have all the dwarf units have ranged weapons, rather than manually combining units on the battlefield, but I guess that doesn't fit with the tabletop unit roster or something. Now, dwarves don't have access to magic in the game's lore, but in order to stop them being less deep to use in battle, their technology could have fulfilled a similar role, although I hadn't really thought about this before now, so bear with me on this. For example, instead of calling down bolts of lightning on the enemy, you might have the ability to do a bombing run with your gyrocopters based back in the camp, using up some stats like ammunition instead of magic points. Instead of the winds of magic recharging, it's your engineers at camp refueling and rearming your attack craft. Some indirect fire from distant great cannons, or having some miners suddenly tunnel up behind enemy lines could be other examples of non-magical things that could give the dwarves more to do during the battle. In terms of the campaign map, I think the underway is an excellent mechanic for dwarves and is pretty much what I would have wanted to represent allowing them to sneak around underground. Possible expansions of it could have been to allow super quick travel between settlements in the mountains, representing that those tunnels would be much more used and might have railways to speed things up. I would combine this with having the dwarves have fewer movement points than other races, since they have little legs and lots to carry after all, which would mean that they're really strategically strong in the mountains since they'd be teleporting between their bases super fast, but weak in the open field since they can't choose their battles against faster opponents. Finally, a small boon I had hoped for was to have the dwarven settlements take only limited damage from sacking, to represent that they can simply move their treasures and infrastructure deep underground when their surface carracks are attacked, further enhancing their defensive nature. Perhaps razing should have been less effective too, leaving the settlement depopulated but not entirely without buildings, meaning that if you recolonize it later, you start with a few buildings already there. After all, dwarven society is carved into the very rock of the mountains. It should really be harder to scrub it out than some poxy human village made of wood and mud, but right now the game's razing and sacking mechanics make no such distinctions. In summary, I think the game design for the dwarves shows promise, but doesn't offer gameplay distinct enough from the other factions in their current form. But with more emphasis on creative, static formations that can include their war machines in new ways, and their underground empires in the campaign, they could emerge as a very unique Total War experience. The humans, I had assumed, would be the faction that embodied traditional Total War mechanics and generally offered the least in terms of new gameplay options. And I guess I was right about that. Misplace your glasses and you'd think you're playing Medieval 2. Orderly formations, varied units with clear roles, standard ranged melee, artillery, combined arms armies, all this usual Total War fare suits the Empire very well. So because of that, Empire were really just what I expected, in the battles at least, and I can't think of any appropriate improvements even now. No doubt people who actually know the Empire lore in detail might be able to, but for me it all seems just about perfect. The campaign map is where playing as Empire confused me and greatly diverged from my expectations, although perhaps I understand why things were created as they are. I was imagining that the Empire would have a strong focus on the use of vassal armies and giving war targets to them, basically trying as the Emperor to be the puppet master of humanity and hold it all together against the threats from all directions. I'm not really up to speed on the lore, but I never thought that I'd start with just one region when I picked the Empire. I imagined you'd have 4 or 5 of your own regions in the middle and then the rest of the Empire as vassals. Combined with having decent relations with the French, Spanish and Italians, since they're all human, I thought you'd be very much leading a humans versus everything else sort of campaign, where you had big and flashy armies to play with early on. So instead, in case you don't know, you start with virtually nothing, and must take the Emperor on a tour of conquest or confederation to actually create the human empire as a single state, rather than the mix of subservient states I understand it to be from the lore. In practice, this means half the campaign as Empire is just fighting all the copy-paste Empire factions, so you can get some power before you think about killing any Orcs, etc. Now, as I said, I can see the appeal of this. It is very uniform, standard, it keeps the theme that all the factions start small and fight their own kin for whatever reason, and makes sure there is a progression of sorts as the player strives to get bigger and unlock more interesting units. It just seems the least forgivable in the case of the Empire. And of course, with my line of thinking being that Warhammer's design would be all about variety, I assumed they would be the one really big faction to make it distinct from the others. Not such an outlandish expectation, given that previous games had a mix of factions that started big and small. So the question is, would the game actually be better if the Empire was more unified from the beginning? Clearly I don't know, but at least we can say it would make the Empire feel more unique. Although I didn't expect this at all, thinking about it now, I guess Empire's campaign gameplay should have been the place for all the old politics and family tree systems and the like to make their appearances from previous games, controlling the relations of all the Empire states and maintaining your authority as Emperor by successfully defending the human lands. Perhaps a fair compromise would be to make it like the Western Roman Empire in Attila, where you start with a lot of power, but there are so many threats that keeping hold of that power is just as hard as winning it from a single region start point. Fail to stop the scaling from reaching Middenheim, their state joins a collection of other discontented empire states in rejecting your authority, so you just lost a load of vassals and you still have to overcome their childish reactions to somehow stop the scaling from destroying us all. I just don't think you should fight the other human factions, basically, unless you really want to. Now the other thing with Empire is that as I was playing, I most felt the lack of other campaign features such as economy management, building variety, province specializations, and the still absent sense that there are actually any inhabitants of your territory other than a population surplus bar. But that's a game design rant that applies to most of the modern Total War games, and is really just the ravings of an old veteran who doesn't like the very deliberate direction CA is taking the series in. So yeah, I'm not going to go down that road for this video, or we'll be here for hours as I list every possible idea for buildings, edicts, micromanagement under the sun. Incidentally, if you do want that, there's a 7-hour video series of me doing that for Rome 2, I'll link it in the description or something. For now, let's mercifully move on. Now with the vampires, I knew so little about them before the game's release that I didn't really have a particular expectation for them, other than that they would have zombies and other creatures to play with. I had presumed they would just be used like normal units, and they mostly are, but I was pleasantly surprised that the Raise Dead mechanic on the campaign map offered an interesting, on-theme way to make recruitment a little different. Thinking about it, I would go further and say that for lots of units, it should have been the only way to recruit things, as the idea of recruiting a band of zombies seems strange. Isn't what you're actually doing there just going around finding recently deceased people and necroing them back to life? Assuming that's what's going on, I think it might have been cooler if your Raise Dead pool always had a certain number of zombie units available, with that number going up as your population/city levels go up. Makes sense, since the more people there are, the more people will have died recently enough to be a zombie. Same deal for skeletons, just a longer wait. Perhaps the Raise Dead mechanic could have been made a little bit more unique and important by having all the human-y units like zombies, skeletons and graveguard be only available via raising the dead. You unlock more recruitment by improving your population rather than upgrading military buildings. That would certainly give the vampires a unique approach to the campaign, which of course compounds with an existing unique feature that the Raise Dead pool increases after battles. The recruitment buildings you do have would be for the monsters, I guess, as maybe they do need people to go find them and train them or whatever, they're not just the products of dark magic. As for the Wraith units, which are basically ghosts, I don't know enough about the lore to say which side of all this they would fall on. But the point is, Raise Dead should be front and centre for recruitment, since raising the dead is pretty much the vampire's thing. We can apply the same sentiment to battles, where pretty much the only expectation I had for the vampires didn't materialise. I had sussed that the whole deal with the vampires is that opponents they kill can be raised to fight for them. And not just as zombies after the battle via that Raise Dead feature, but actually during the battle, and that would be the source of their unique battle mechanics. There would be a focus on turning enemy units by raising their losses onto your own side right away. So you might start with only a small and weak force of zombies and skeletons that are all expendable, but the heavily armed and armoured enemy units you manage to damage create new units for you to use. So imagine your Graveguard, weaker than they are in the real game, manage to kill a handful of Empire Greatswords. Instantly, as long as your Vampire Lord or similar dark magic user is near, you get a unit of Greatswords on your side containing the number of men killed from the enemy unit so far. It's right there in the melee, so we'll start fighting for you right away, and unlike your zombies and skeletons, these guys only just died, so still have all their equipment and most of their motor abilities, making them much better than your permanent armies of trash. Since your zombie greatswords would kill more greatswords to add to their own ranks, they might slowly be able to defeat the whole unit, subject to all the balancing decisions that would have to be made around this. but in principle I think it would be a nice lore-friendly and unique battle system for the vampires. Your campaign armies are weak, but you always get new units in the battles themselves which are just slightly weaker versions of the enemy units you've defeated. You wouldn't be just playing with generic human zombies anymore. You'd get zombie gunners, zombie orcs, zombie giant spiders, loads more unit variety by just letting them have all the units from the rest of the game, perhaps with a spooky reskin. The more I think about it, the more I'm up for this. Not sure if you get to keep the units after the battle, perhaps in the form of regular zombies now that they've degenerated with the dark magic only able to prevent it going beyond a certain point. That's another question for balance, but it seems plausible that you could get a rhythm going where you go into battle with loads of terrible units. They get killed but give you enough new units to win the fight, and then all the new units become the trash that you start the next battle with. All with the notable exception of your monster units who just work as they do now, a bastion of familiarity for Total War experts. That would be damn unique both in this game and the Total War franchise. I love it, make it happen, mod it someone. The more I think about it, the more I need that. Right, time for the fifth and final imagination attack, this time onto Chaos. There's something big about Chaos that really surprised me when I started playing as them. They're terrible. They're really weak. They start with few troops and no ability to recruit the Chaos core units. Now I guess this is coming from the same school of thought as the decision to make Empire really weak as well. I just thought it would be more like how Chaos works when you don't play as them. Like you get 3 stacks or something and you just go wild. The challenge would come from something other than being the featherweight in a heavyweight tournament. Like with the Empire situation, I don't know if a stronger start would make it better overall, but also like with the Empire, we can say it would fit the lore and feel of the faction a lot better. A Chaos campaign right now is just running away from enemies and finding little 4-unit garrisons to auto-resolve. And it's like that from start to finish really, since you never actually need to fight armies. Your goal is based on sacking or razing towns, rather than more broadly killing people and impressing the Chaos gods with your skill in battle or whatever, which, based on my very limited lore exposure, was what I was assuming would be. To imagine a totally different way of designing the Chaos experience, and to make it unique both to Total War games and this game specifically, I would have liked to see the Chaos Invasion be a stream of evil from the north, where new armies are given to you periodically at the top of the map, however they're hard to recruit into if you lose units while fighting. The catch would be that you have to impress the gods to get them to give you control of these hordes, so you need to be killing the foul mortals in sufficient volumes with the armies you do have. It adds a depth of strategy since you need to kill enough to get new forces without losing so much that the addition of these forces doesn't just get you back to how strong you were before. Units would have no upkeep, with all funds gained through fighting going right into praying for new armies, technology upgrades or buildings, meaning you're constantly getting stronger if you play it all right. I don't think Total War's done that before, and it would really fit the mood of a Chaos campaign. It's all just the dark whims of the gods, and the lives of mortals are a mere plaything, a statistic in their game of favours between their special servants. The horde building and economy, being basically nothing as it stands, would probably become even less important, which is my main concern about all this. But I guess the buildings would focus more on giving passive buffs to the army than recruitment options. It would be a trade-off, since you earn your Chaos favour by killing and then have to decide if you want to spend it on a new army from the waste or upgrading an army on the front lines. Technically you have that choice already, of course, it's just harder to actually get a second army up and running thanks to the balancing and horde infighting. Overall, I think this slightly different approach to Chaos would make it more fun and generally destructive, since you have more reason to fight a battle even if you won't actually win. Just get the favour for killing and pop out another band of crazed warriors and monsters to continue the onslaught. It's all about the death and glory that the powers of Chaos get their kicks off, and hopefully the player would come to sympathise with said gods to get more fun out of the game than the Chaos campaign offers right now. Playing as Chaos should be all about feeling powerful, and as it is now, I was unpleasantly surprised to find it's the opposite. So that's it for the factions. I just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of general surprises that left me scratching my head. The big one is a lack of focus on religions and belief. I guess this pairs with the lack of focus on your people in general. I just imagined that we'd have an evolution of the religion mechanics in Attila, since in the Warhammer world, the gods are actually confirmed to be real and regularly intervene in people's lives. You think it would be a really, really religious world. Perhaps in the usual lore it is. I was just surprised that in Warhammer you don't spend much time focusing on managing religion other than the mysterious chaos corruption, which I guess is at least in part representative of chaos god worship. I don't have any particular suggestions here or anything, I just somehow thought that the fact that gods and magic and things are confirmed real and used for practical purposes day to day would make creatures be very motivated by religious concerns, especially the orcs and chaos, and the fact there aren't mechanics revolving around your relationship to these gods seemed like a missed opportunity for something fun and new. Another slightly similar thing that left me confused was something that's quite trivial really, but I'll mention it in case anyone happens to agree. The monsters are weirdly balanced. I was amazed, in a bad way, at how upon seeing monsters like the Vargeist and the Giants in battle for the first time, they barely did any damage, and in turn barely took any damage. I had presumed they would be given an extreme stat arrangement where their attacks were devastating but they were easy to kill. A giant is, as implied, giant, powerful. Humans to them are just like little Lego men to us. I didn't understand why my giant seemed to spend most of the battles just looking around, hitting the odd guy with a stick, gradually working through infantry units while they get slashed down on their feet. I had imagined that a giant would be sweeping aside entire units with the same ease that a human sweeps clean a chessboard with a single blow, getting dozens of kills with each of its slow but huge strikes. In turn, since they are without armour and generally fleshy biological things, I expected them to be easily injured. In particular, getting hit with blasting charges or great cannons or volleys of concentrated gunfire or magic would bring them down right away. So they would be fragile but a deadly weapon, useful for blasting open a line as an attack begins even if they fall quickly once the main fight starts. Instead, these monsters function roughly like regular infantry, having similar stats and the same total HP, using area of effect attacks to make up for their low or singular numbers. It seems to be the most conservative possible way to treat the monsters, and I still can't help but think that the epicness level would have been much higher with different balancing decisions and more attacks that utilise their size and their brute strength to actually overwhelm the enemy in the way they appear to be physically capable of. Next, I thought I should probably say something about the controversial region occupation rules. Running with the theme of this video, yes, that did indeed surprise me. It seems very odd to me, but I am quite distant from the details of the lore they were using to justify it. But lore aside, the decision limits both the depth and replayability of the game, which at the time seemed crazy considering the initial lack of full mod support was already crippling the game in that regard compared to previous titles. And then in retrospect, when you consider that in terms of raw design and gameplay, it's also the least deep and replayable entry in the series, it beggars belief that they would even try to put this in. They need more content, more options for the player, more strategic choices to make, not fewer. So yes, surprising indeed. To me, it's a great worry that the forces at work designing the series I love have drifted from the design philosophies I hoped for. It's something that really me and people like me are just going to have to accept about this franchise. Personally, I'm hoping that another company will fill the deep niche created as CA becomes more and more distant from the other famous developer in the genre, Paradox Games, who for many are too deep, too complex to be fun for the middling, genre-hopping market, sometimes called core gamers. Anyway, time for the final Total War Warhammer surprise I wanted to bring up, and that's the ending, in that there isn't one. When you complete the list of campaign objectives, it all just ends, leaving you to sit and silently read a list of statistics about what just happened, which seems somehow unprofessional, like nothing was resolved, no summary or conclusion to all the time spent to reach that point. I guess it feels like